Welcome to the Faith in Question podcast, where we scrutinize the Christian faith alongside the perspective of the nonbeliever, sometimes interviewing them, sometimes responding to their critiques of the Christian faith, their reasonable critiques. Today, we're going to be continuing the discussion about Jesus as a false prophet or a failed prophet, a common criticism. You'll hear in the YouTube social media world, as well as in the scholarly world, that Jesus made specific predictions, 3 in particular in the Gospel of Matthew, where he said, or he predicted, that he would return in the lifetime of the disciples, and he obviously didn't return. So he's a false prophet or a failed prophet. And the passages are Matthew 10, verse 23, Matthew 16, verse 28, and Matthew 24, verse 34. But there are some other passages as well in the epistles that have to be considered. So we're going to just do, in between the interviews, a series of podcasts addressing this specific question. It just dominates the scholarly world and the critical world, those critical of the Christian faith. And I think even Christians will be familiar with these passages and have wondered themselves, what do they really mean? And for my part, I've always been a little unsatisfied with the explanations that were provided in commentaries and by Christian scholars. There have been a few different attempts, different tactics, I guess, different ways to interpret these verses, and I just have never thought they were overly convincing. And I certainly wasn't convinced by the critics either. I think there's problems, in other words, with pretty much any way people try to interpret them or try to explain them. I think they run into serious problems. And so one conclusion one could draw is just that there's sort of a hopeless contradiction within the Gospel of Matthew itself, because the one time Jesus quite clearly is asked in Matthew 24, verse 36 following, about the timing of his coming. When is the timing of his coming? When is it? That's in the beginning of Matthew 24. And when he answers it, he says very famously that no one knows the hour, not even he, the Son, knows the hour of his coming. So it seems, the day or the hour, it seems pretty clear that he is saying he does not know the timing. He's not offering the timing of his coming. And yet there's these earlier statements that raise the question, well, it seems like he is saying something about the timing, or at least that's the way people have interpreted them. So what do we do with these passages? And what I'd like to give is first a kind of canon or a yardstick for how I myself kind of decide whether I think someone's being persuasive or not, and you can apply this to my explanations or if you want to. And that is, first of all, I'm looking for some sort of depth where they connect various dots. In other words, they have to be able to explain their interpretation within the natural thought flow or progression of the narrative just in that very passage, as well as the sequence of stories around it. If they can't account for that, that raises a question in my mind whether they really understand what's going on. Then there's the precise word choice, the exact wording that is used by the various evangelists in these passages, and then any alterations between the evangelists and how they're interpreting the same passage, if they have the same passage, if there's an alteration, does someone's explanation account for that? And then, of course, just the context of the book as a whole and the perspective of the writer. There may be a few other things I'm leaving out, but just to show you, there's a lot of dots to connect, and I'm sort of looking for someone to be able to do that in order for me to feel a confidence that their reading is worthy of serious consideration. It still may not be the best reading. It still may fall short, but I'm at least looking for these kinds of layers. And then the final thing I'm looking at is just a concise, simple sort of declaration of exactly how they read it and why. So in other words, the more words someone has to use to explain something, sometimes the less confident I get that they clearly grasp it, and that's including from my own understanding. So I'm looking for those two abilities from someone's explanation, and often I hear one or the other, and you really need both layers to feel confident, I think, about it. So if you're just taking, for example, the one we looked at last time, in this particular podcast, we're going to look at Matthew 16, verse 28. But in the previous podcast where we started with the first story, where Jesus said, "Amen, I say to you, you will not bring your mission to a finish in the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes," I went through multiple layers of how those sets of instructions to the disciples for the beginning of the Great Commission, what you would call phase 1 of the Great Commission, during Jesus' ministry, just to the cities of Israel. I went through various layers of trying to connect the various dots of how the narrative progresses, how it's arranged, the word choice Jesus used, and so on. But then you also need to be able to just very concisely explain why this statement, what this statement is about and why it's not about what most people tend to think it's about. Because on its face, when someone says to you, well, this is describing the timing of Jesus' coming, well, that sounds right when you first hear it and read the verse, but you don't need to work that hard to realize there's a problem with this interpretation. And the first problem is that in the actual statement, neither of the two clauses actually gives any kind of chronological terminus. They're not inherently statements about timing. I'll give you, to show you that, I'll give you a contrast. When Jesus says to Peter, the rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times, there's 2 statements. There's the rooster crowing, and then there's the other one, you'll deny me 3 times. But the rooster crowing is an inherently chronological terminus. It's the equivalent of the sunrise, because the rooster crows in the morning right before sunrise. So when Jesus says to him in the evening after dinner, the rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times, that clause is intrinsically providing a chronological terminus. It's sunrise, it's the morning. It's sometime between when Jesus predicted it and the morning, Peter will deny him 3 times. But when you get to the statement in Matthew 10, the one where it says, you will not bring your mission to its finish in the cities of Israel. You will not finish your mission to the cities of Israel. And then the other one, the Son of Man coming, neither of those statements provides an intrinsically chronological terminus. There's no specific moment that's intrinsic about when Jesus would come. It's the statement of him coming is not marking a particular well-known time of day or time of the month or time of the year or anything, and neither is the completion of their mission. If I said, when I finish the paint job on my barn, I'm not providing a specific chronological terminus, meaning I'm not connecting it to a well-established time. When I say when I finish the painting of my barn, that doesn't tell you it's going to be on Thursday or Tuesday or Saturday or this month or next month. That's not giving you a chronological time. That's my point. It's telling you that about action, not about time. Yes, the action has to be brought to completion, yes, but it's not telling you when that would happen. So that's just to I'm trying to disassociate the statement itself from having anything to do with timing, because I don't think that's what Jesus meant at all, that had anything to do with timing. He's just telling them in the context that they're going to face persecution, they're going to face opposition, and that they have license to leave a city that is vigorously persecuting them, opposing them, rejecting them. They can leave that city and go to another city. That's in chapter 10, verse 22. That's the verse right before the famous prediction, amen, I say to you, you will not bring your mission to the cities of Israel to a finish until the Son of Man comes. And in the context, what he means clearly, I think, is that whereas the persecution and the opposition does give you license to go to another particular city. You can go on to another city or to another city or whatever you need to do to avoid the persecution. You don't just need to be masochistic and accept that you must suffer. You can leave one city and go to another city. What you cannot do is allow the persecution to get you into your head that the entire mission is complete, is over, is done. That you cannot get into your head. You must keep pressing forward with your mission, and it will not be brought to its finish until the Son of Man comes. So you can see the most natural way to read it has nothing to do with timing. It's just exhorting them not to stop their entire mission, even though they can go from city to city, depending on the level of persecution. So that was chapter 10. Again, I didn't go into here all the little details about, you can go back and listen to that podcast. I'm just showing you how you have to be able to explain it in a very concise, very clear way, and so that the most natural reading comes to the surface, so people can see that it really doesn't have anything to do with timing in that particular case. When, however, we get to chapter 16, verse 28, the verse we're going to cover today, that's different. The statement is where Jesus says that that there are some of us who are standing here, right in front of him, some of you standing here, will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And in this statement, it's quite clear that tasting death, that death does provide some kind of chronological or intrinsically chronological terminus to what Jesus is predicting, because people don't live forever. It's not like some jobs I have around the house which feel like they're endless, and I never quite bring them to completion. Some of the projects I have. In the case of death, I mean, we all know that 150 years from now, I'll be dead. Probably 50 years from now, I'll be dead. So there is a kind of natural chronological terminus to this statement in Matthew 26, verse 28. So I agree with everybody that when it comes to Matthew 16, it's not true of Matthew 10, but it is true here in Matthew 16 that Jesus does give a specific chronological end to this prediction. And so what he's saying is going to happen in the lifetime of some of the disciples who were standing there in his presence. I don't think that's really debatable. And that's why this is the other verses sometimes get thrown in with this one, but I think this is actually clearer in that respect. Now, let's be a little bit more precise about the wording before we get on to what's going on in the context. In the actual statement, he says that some that are standing here will not taste death. That's a very specific way of saying you're going to die, right? Because he could have just said you will not die. They will not die. That there's places in Greek that is said, and of course that could have been said. But he has a very specific expression. It's word choice, that they will not taste death. Why does he describe it that way? Because tasting something is where you just begin or you initiate the process of eating, right? To taste something. Like when it says in Hebrews that Jesus tasted death, it's using that expression because Jesus died, but he was only dead for a very short time, a couple of days, and then he was raised from the dead. He just tasted death. He did fully die, but he only tasted death. He's not like most people where they stay dead. So this is used in other parts of the New Testament as well as outside in the classical Greek literature, that this use of the word taste, by the way, it's also in the Old Testament, but this idea of tasting death means sort of you won't even sniff of death, meaning you won't even be near death before you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. In other words, it's not just going to be right before you die. It's going to be well before you die. You're not even going to have tasted death. You won't even begin the dying process or something to that effect. I'm just trying to give the overall impression is that it won't be anywhere near your death. It'll be before that, okay, that he will come. Secondly, that the coming of the Son of Man in his kingdom is clearly eschatological. What the term eschatological, eschaton, means the last things. It just means the culmination of the grand program of God for the restoration of the world that involves the deliverance of the world, the deliverance of the righteous, and the punishment of the wicked. So there's deliverance through judgment. So that's the end times, or the end of all things, the restoration of all things is the expression used in Acts chapter 2. So clearly Jesus is referring to that because he's just described his coming in the previous verse as coming in the glory of his Father with his angels. So he's clearly talking about a glorious coming. He's talking about an angelic retinue attending him. In other words, it's very public, and there's heavenly beings with him. And then he says in chapter 16, verse 27, again, this is just the previous verse, he says that he will render to every man according to his conduct. So again, this is a time of judgment, a time of finality, of the culmination of things. So it's clear, I think that's what he's referring to. But, and here's the first layer of problem if you just stop here and you don't look at all in the context at all about what's going on prior to this statement or subsequent to this statement. And that is, there's going to be another statement later, which I referred to earlier already in this podcast, Matthew 24, verses 36 following, where Jesus is asked explicitly about the timing of his coming, and he answers plainly and frankly, not even he knows the timing of his coming. So it seems like a blatant contradiction between this verse in chapter 16, verse 28, and this verse later in chapter 24. So in other words, if we're just reading it without looking at anything else, these two statements just looked at on a page appear to say the two contradictory things, that Jesus does know the timing of his coming. It will be before the disciples even get close to death. And also, he says he doesn't know the timing of his coming. So those two things seem just on their face to be contradictory. And that for the person who then wants to just stop right there and not look at anything else, well, this is why, first of all, I guess you just want it to be a contradiction. You don't really want to think beyond anything else. You just want a contradiction, okay? So that's a problem. If you just want it so badly there to be a contradiction, you're not even prepared to think beyond just looking at the two statements in isolation on a page. Secondly, just commonsensically, does the writer really, is Matthew, does the Gospel of Matthew not show enough of carefulness in the writing of the overall progression of the narrative and connecting things across various large parts of the narrative? Some statements, the opening of the book where Jesus is described as his name is Emmanuel, God is with us, and then the closing of the book where his final words are, lo, I am with you always, those two ideas clearly connect. It's the opening of the book, the opening story of the book where Jesus is named, and then you have the closing words of Jesus, and the two echo one another. This is carefully thought out, is my point. So is it really the case that Matthew just was totally unaware of how contradictory these statements are? I would say that seems unlikely, so I at least need to look more closely at the narrative. But again, we're just talking now at this point, two statements on a page in isolation, but that's not the way we read. We have to actually read the stories in their context and see what's going on. And here is where I'd like to build the case that you really need to follow the progression of the narrative here, because I do not think in the traditional way of reading this verse, I think, and how people understand it in the critical world, I do not think you can make sense of that given what follows in the narrative. I think you will run into a train wreck in trying to interpret the statement in a too sort of wooden way, as you will see here in just a few minutes. So let's just set the context. Matthew 16 is where Peter, representing the disciples for the very first time, confesses Jesus as the Messiah, as the Son of the living God. That happens right before this famous passage which includes this prediction. And after he confesses him to be the Messiah, Jesus begins to talk about discipleship. And the reason he's going to talk about discipleship, and the reason he's even going to be talking about his coming, is because he makes an announcement on the heels of Peter's confession for the first time in the book that his ministry is going to end in his death and his resurrection. So that happens for the very first time in the book, right in our passage, right after Peter makes this confession. Now, everything that the disciples have heard about Jesus' coming would naturally be associated with what the prophets say about the Messiah's coming, which is that it is eschatological. John the Baptist described the coming of the Messiah in these terms, that the axe is laid at the root of the tree, that he is going to baptize in fire, like in a judgment. So there is this anticipation that in the coming of the Messiah, it was eschatological, it was the restoration of the world through judgment. And that's certainly the way the disciples would have understood this kind of language up till this story. Okay, this story is going to throw a twist on their assumption. And what's going to happen is after Jesus talks about his death and resurrection, the disciples' initial reaction is denial. Probably not only because he's saying he's going to die, but also because he's speaking about his resurrection. But in their minds, there's only one resurrection, the great resurrection described by Daniel chapter 12 and so on, which is at the end of the ages. It's the end of history. And the idea that he's going to be dead until this culmination of things is a contradiction in what they're anticipating from him. They're anticipating that he's here, the Messiah is here, and therefore this is the eschatology, this is the time of the grand resurrection and so on. He doesn't need to die, he just needs to be part of the raising of the dead and so on, which he's already done in previous stories. So, or at least begun to do from their perspective with like Jairus' daughter. So all this is to say that the disciples simply deny or are in denial of when Jesus says that this coming, that his ministry is going to end in his death and resurrection. And so what follows then is Jesus redefines discipleship. He says, if you're going to follow him, you're going to need to deny yourself and take up your cross, which is clearly a reference to crucifixion, the particular way in which the Romans executed criminals, that you are going to face opposition, persecution, and you're going to have to be prepared to die on a kind of daily basis for my name's sake and be prepared to suffer and so on. And this is a completely different vision that the disciples have. They are anticipating that they're going to be enthroned beside Jesus when he's enthroned, as turns up in Matthew 20 and so on. So, or Matthew 19 into 20. The disciples are going to be still thinking like this. So Jesus is trying to explain to them that this coming is going to end in his death. It is not going to end in the full eschatological vision that they are thinking of from the prophets. And that is why, after he describes this and warns the disciples that in following him, they'll need to persevere and stay loyal to him, because he will still come as they're expecting eschatologically. That's in verse 27. The Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with the angels, and he will render to everyone according to his conduct. So there is going to be a future eschatological coming of Jesus. He reaffirms this in verse 27 after he has redefined discipleship. In other words, for some undefined duration of time after his death, the disciples will have to face persecution and themselves face potentially real death, martyrdom. And then at some later point, undefined as far as its timing, he will return, as they were expecting him now, in the full restoration of the world through judgment, in the glory, the full glory of his Father, with the angels to execute the judgments of God and so on the world, and to deliver the righteous and raise the dead and all of that. So he reaffirms that in verse 27. That eschatological vision is still going to happen. It's just not going to happen with this coming. In other words, he's introduced a second coming, a glorious coming, the eschatological coming. Or when I say introduce it, what I mean is he's announcing that that's not going to be right now. It's still going to come. They weren't wrong to anticipate that his coming would result in this eschatological vision. It's just that it's not going to be in this coming, it's going to be a future coming. And notice he's not giving the timing of anything at this point. But then he says something. He says, "Amen, I say to you, that there some are standing here who will not even taste death. They won't even taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And clearly, on its face, it sounds like what he's saying is that I will be coming eschatologically, and you will see it before you even get near death. So if you just stopped right there, you would say, okay, well, here it is, plain as day. Jesus is predicting the timing of his coming. It is going to be of his eschatological coming, it is going to be in before the disciples even get near to death, or some of them get near to death. All right? So that would then set it within a few decades or whatever. Now, keep in mind, Matthew is writing, most critical scholars think he's writing in the 80s, which would be 50 years after this statement. So that's well beyond the timing of disciples not even being near death, right? So if that's the case, Matthew's knowingly including what is a failed prediction. Again, that is another reason to think we're missing something here if we just stopped the narrative right there. And I want to say, clearly, up until this point, I'm trying to make the case of just the natural progression of the narrative, what you would think Jesus meant by that. What the disciples probably thought he meant by that in that moment. But then you're going to see something change in the next story. The disciples themselves are going to look differently at what Jesus just said based on the next story. And that's why I think Matthew can include this with great confidence, and why the other evangelists, of course, include it with seemingly no problem whatsoever. And we'll see what Luke does with it. Now, the next thing that happens is the Mount of Transfiguration. And I've heard many Christians over the years say, well, Jesus' prediction in 1628 is fulfilled in the Mount of Transfiguration. And I would say, okay, I can see how it could at some level fulfill the prediction, because they do get a glimpse of Jesus. They see Jesus in a kind of transfigured state, a glorified state or whatever. So you could say that's must be probably what he's referring to. But it's just not by itself, it's not decisive enough to just state that's what he must have meant. We need more clarity in order to claim that that is exactly what Jesus meant, and that that's how the apostles understood it, and that's how Matthew, the writer, understood it, or Mark or Luke. So the Mount of Transfiguration is next, and then, of course, the descent from the Mount of Transfiguration and the conversation with regarding Elijah. So there are a number of things we have to resolve. Why does Jesus say only some of the disciples will see this coming in the kingdom? Why is this prediction right here after, the other things that we discussed, the confession of Peter, the denial of Jesus' announcement that he's going to die at the end of his ministry, and so on? Why is any of this important to Matthew, or why did Matthew think it would be important to readers? How does this relate to that discussion later where he predicts, or where he says emphatically in chapter 24, he doesn't know the timing of his coming? Why is there no mention of the temple destruction? Some people say that this is all kind of referring to the destruction of the temple and the judgment that was going to come in 70 AD, but there's no indication in the story that Jesus is referring to that, when he could have gone on to mention that, or Matthew could have made a point of clarifying that that's what he was talking about, but he doesn't do that. And then why does it matter that the Mount of Transfiguration is here, right after this prediction, or not? Is that irrelevant? Could the Mount of Transfiguration have happened earlier and that not have mattered? And then why is there this chronological bridge? At the beginning of this story, in all three synoptic evangelists, they specify the duration of days between this prediction in chapter 16, verse 28, and then the Mount of Transfiguration. Now, meaning it's about a week after. You might think that that's really not particularly important. But if you read the whole of Luke, the whole of Matthew, and the whole of Mark, what you'd find is there's not a single other example, not one, where the narrator provides a duration of multiple days as the link between two separate stories or events, other than, of course, his resurrection at the end. The famous 3-day prediction, because there's a prediction. But in no other example is this provided. So you have to account for that. Why do the narrators, all three of the synoptic evangelists, think it's important to include that it was just a handful of days after Jesus made this prediction that they then went up into the mountain that became the Mountain of Transfiguration? That, in other words, it suggests that there's something of a link between the two that all of the writers are trying to make that they don't try to make in any other story in the Gospels. And then, of course, the bit about Elijah, the conversations that come down from the Mount of Olives, does that follow naturally on all of this stuff, or is that kind of irrelevant? Again, we're just looking at the progression. So these are all kinds of questions. And frankly, let me be blunt. If you cannot concisely explain to me an answer to all of my questions, it's unlikely that you have understood the progression in the narrative yet, or at least not understood it clearly to be able to answer what are really simple questions, I think. All right, now let's start just for a moment with Luke. And the reason we're going to start with Luke is because Luke, almost all scholars, I shouldn't say it that way, a lot of scholars understand Luke to have been written after Matthew and to have used Matthew. Some think he's only using Mark, and that's fine because Mark has the same basic content as Matthew, so as far as that goes, it's not particularly relevant. But all scholars pretty much are looking at Luke as someone who is familiar with at least Mark, if not Mark and Matthew. So, but again, the Mark and Matthean accounts are so similar in their details that for our purpose of the discussion, I'm just going to treat it as if Luke is using Matthew. Okay, so what Luke does is Luke makes the connection between the prediction about the disciples not even getting near to death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. He links that prediction to the Mount of Transfiguration more directly and clearly than Mark or Matthew do. And he does it at the same time that he's dropping something very significant, and that is the conversation about Elijah as they descend from the mountain after the Transfiguration the next day. So keep this in mind. The conversation with Elijah is dropped by Luke. But if I may say, in its place, Luke makes the connection between the prediction and the Mount of Transfiguration more clear. Remember, the prediction says that they will see the Son of Man coming in the glory of the Father with the angels. That's how it's worded in Matthew and Mark. But in Luke says that the wording Jesus used was that they will see the Son of, when he's talking about the verse right before the prediction. So this would be the equivalent of Matthew 16:27 for those of you, if you have a Bible out. It's that the Son of Man, Luke says, will come not in the glory of the Father, but in his own glory and in the glory of the Father with the angels. Are you catching that? In other words, Matthew and Mark say he's coming in the glory of his Father. Luke says he's coming in his own glory and in the glory of the Father. Okay? So he adds that little detail to clarify that it's his own personal glory that will be on display, and it will also be the glory of the Father, and there'll be angels present, this eschatological coming. Then comes the prediction, where Jesus says that some of them that are standing here will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. That's in Luke the same, basically, as it is, or very similar to what it is in Matthew and Mark. Then in the Mount of Transfiguration scene itself, Luke adds in the word glory. He says that Elijah and Moses appeared in glory with Jesus. Now, Matthew and Mark do not have that expression in the narration of the event. We're not now talking about the words of anybody. We're just describing the authors are just describing the event. Matthew and Mark do not describe it that way. They never at any point specifically use the word glory in the description of the Mount of Transfiguration. They describe Jesus as his garments shining, like they have been washed by something not even someone on earth could wash clothes as white as them, and so on. His face shines like the sun, these kinds of things, but never using the term glory. But Luke adds that they all appeared in glory Jesus along with Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration. So notice what Luke has done there. He's had Jesus in his description of his coming specifically state that it's not just the glory of the Father, it's his own glory that he will appear in. And then in the scene of the Mount of Transfiguration, he describes it in that exact way, that he is appearing in glory. They're all appearing in glory. So that's Luke's way of making it clear that the prediction about this eschatological coming that they would see, that they do actually see a glimpse of it on the Mount of Transfiguration. All right? Now, a critical scholar would reasonably conclude that, yes, Luke is tying this prediction to the Mount of Transfiguration. And so Luke is interpreting Matthew and Mark as the prediction refers to the event of the Mount of Transfiguration. But a critical scholar, again, could reasonably conclude that Luke is doing this because it's an embarrassment. I mean, Jesus basically predicted he was going to come. He didn't come. And by the time Luke is living and writing his gospel, they think in the 80s, many scholars think, critical scholars think in the 80s, really we don't know, but let's just assume they're right, and he's writing later, and he's looking at Mark and Matthew, and he sees this as kind of an embarrassment to him, Jesus never came. And so what Luke does is he alters it, and he connects it to the Mount of Transfiguration, the prediction, in order to basically rescue Jesus and rescue Christianity from an embarrassment. Okay? Now, again, I'm telling you, a critical scholar, I think, could reasonably conclude that that is what Luke is doing, except for one major problem. The reason it's not actually reasonable to conclude that that is what Luke is doing is because Luke has also glaringly dropped the story about Elijah, the conversation about Elijah, from his account of the Mount of Transfiguration. So we have to account for that. And I don't think you can account for it as clearly unless you understand what's going on in that conversation and how it relates to the original prediction and why Luke is even interpreting the Mount of Transfiguration as the fulfillment of this prediction. All right? It's only when you understand that Luke is actually reading Matthew and Mark very closely and understands precisely what is going on in the story, what Jesus meant, how the apostles themselves interpreted it in the original event, how Matthew and Mark are faithfully representing the apostolic interpretation of the people who actually went through the event. And then how Luke, because he has dropped the conversation with Elijah, decides to make it a little bit more clear what Jesus meant in his prediction. In other words, the whole thing rests on that conversation about Elijah. Okay? So let's now go back in our minds to Matthew chapter 17. As the disciples are coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration, the few apostles that were there, Peter, James, and John, and they begin to ask Jesus a question. All right? And you are not going to understand this question if you don't realize how they're interpreting the Mount of Transfiguration and its connection to Jesus' prediction about his eschatological coming. All right? What they say is this: how do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? That's the apostolic question that they put to Jesus as they are descending from this experience of the Mount of Transfiguration. What do they mean? I mean, what do the words just literally mean? How do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Well, it means that the scribes teach officially in synagogues and so on and in the temple that before some other coming, Elijah must come. Isn't that what these words must mean? In other words, Elijah must come first is their question. How is it that Elijah must come first? Isn't Elijah supposed to come first? That's their question. But the expression come first means come in relation to some other coming, right? To come first means to come before some other coming, or someone else's coming. Do you see how those words have to mean that? They can't mean anything else. Elijah must come first before something else comes, or someone else comes. Now, the passage that all of this centers around is in the prophet Malachi. Anybody can go and read Malachi for themselves and look at the description in chapters 3 and 4, the context of the prediction of the coming of Elijah. What is the function of the coming of Elijah? And the answer is, it's very simple, that God, Yahweh, announces he himself is personally coming. In fact, it says exactly these things. Behold, he, meaning Yahweh, is coming. Okay, that's clear. It's not hard to misread the passage. It's talking about the coming of the Lord, of Yahweh. He is coming. And then when he comes, he's going to deliver the righteous and judge the wicked. He's going to come to restore to carry out his restoration. And then it adds this, a few verses after the statement, behold, he is coming, God himself is speaking, and he says, I send Elijah. God is going to send Elijah before the coming of the great and awesome day. What is the coming of the awesome and great day, or the great and awesome day? It's the coming of Yahweh, the coming of God. God is going to come. He's announcing his coming, but Elijah is going to come before the Lord's coming. That's the contrast, okay? Now, that's the passage in Malachi. But how are the apostles understanding this idea of the coming of Elijah? They're understanding it the same way the scribes teach it. That before the eschatological coming of Yahweh in the person of Messiah to carry out the restoration of the world and the judgment and so on, before his coming, Elijah will come and prepare Israel and will begin to set things right. Elijah would come and call on Israel to repent and so on. In other words, there'd be a pre-runner who would come before the coming of the Lord in the person of the Son of David to restore the world. All right? So the apostles, as they are descending the Mount of Transfiguration, now you'll notice, this is very important, they do not ask this question after chapter 16, verse 28, when Jesus says, some of those standing here will not even taste of death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. It's not then that they ask this question. It's after the experience of the Mount of Transfiguration, and Matthew and Mark are very precise that it is as they descend the mountain, just after that experience. In other words, it's the effect of the experience on the Mount of Transfiguration in seeing Jesus that leads the disciples to pose this question to Jesus. What are they asking? What they're saying is that they have just seen Jesus in his glory with resurrected saints from the Old Testament, and they are convinced that his coming right now is going to be the eschatological coming, because they've just glimpsed it. So what they've just witnessed on the Mount of Transfiguration is the eschatological coming. Now, as they come down the mountain, Jesus is not transfigured. He's not appearing like this. And he's just told them, in fact, not to tell anybody what they just saw. Don't tell anybody what you've just seen. But they're anticipating that he's not going to die. He is heading to Jerusalem for the eschatological revelation of what they've just seen on the Mount of Transfiguration. And so they ask him, but isn't Elijah supposed to come first, meaning before the Son of Man's coming in glory with the angels, in his glory, in the glory of the Father, to raise the dead, to carry out the judgment, and so on? So this is what their question means. And again, It's the apostolic interpretation of that experience that's so crucial here. It's the men who went through the experience who are interpreting it as the glimpse, if you will, of the eschatological coming of the Son of Man and his kingdom. That's what leads them to raise the question, because from their perspective, Elijah hasn't shown up. So how could the Son of David be about to show up eschatologically in Israel, and yet Elijah hasn't even come yet? Isn't Elijah supposed to come first? But notice, you can't make sense of their question unless you accept that they have interpreted the Mount of Transfiguration as a glimpse of that eschatological coming. All right? So this, I think, is why Matthew and Mark are faithfully representing and aren't even remotely concerned as if Jesus is a failed prophet. They're understanding that this is the fulfillment of what Jesus meant in this prediction. That's how the apostles interpreted it, and Luke is interpreting it in the same way the apostles interpreted it, and in the same way Matthew and Mark interpreted it, and in the same way Luke, no doubt, is convinced Jesus meant it. He's just making it a little bit clearer, since he doesn't include all that conversation about Elijah. It's not as clear in Luke that the fulfillment of this prediction is in the Mount of Transfiguration itself, so Luke has to draw a couple of dots to make it clearer in a way that Matthew and Mark do not. Now, I won't go into all the other stuff that Jesus says about Elijah. The other bits about the conversation, I think, are fairly straightforward. He basically affirms that, yes, Elijah is going to come still before my eschatological coming. In other words, this is just Jesus reaffirming that this isn't really the time right now of his eschatological coming. He knows that his coming is going to end in his death and resurrection. At some future time, he will come again eschatologically, but not even Jesus, as we'll see later, knows the timing of that. He did know that some of the disciples were going to see what that eschatological coming would look like, the glorified Jesus with resurrected saints and so on. They did get to see a glimpse of that before they died. In fact, it was just a week later. They weren't even close to death. Again, it was just a week later. But all this is just to affirm that there are these two comings. Now, let's go back and just ask ourselves in very concise terms, let's get an answer to some questions. Why did Jesus provide a glimpse of his eschatological coming on the Mount of Transfiguration? And the answer is, he did it right at that point of the narrative because he has just announced that he is going to die and he's going to depart. And he is actually going to be absent, and the disciples will have to bear witness to his name. For his name's sake, they're going to have to suffer for some unknown duration of time. That's the passage right before the prediction. So the disciples are going to face the world in Jesus' absence and face persecution and difficulty and potentially even death, just as he has announced he is going to face, he is going to die. So because his coming is not going to lead immediately to the eschatological revelation of his glory, the restoration of all things, because of that, he announces at the end of that redefinition of discipleship in light of the announcement of his death, he reaffirms that despite what he's saying, there is still going to be an eschatological coming. And the disciples need to realize that though he's died and he's departed, he will come again. And they do need to be faithful and loyal to his name in the face of opposition, even in the face of death, because one day he's going to come back and he will judge. They shouldn't just get to thinking that, hey, he's gone now, we're alone, and maybe this isn't worth it to face all this opposition and persecution. He's gone, he's absent. Why are we going through this? Is this really worth it? Is he ever going to come back? They would have been left with a big question mark. But instead, he affirms or reaffirms he will meet their expectations. He will fulfill the prophets as written. He will come back eschatologically. That's why he's making that statement in verse 27 that he will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and so on, and render to everyone according to their action. It's a reaffirmation to encourage the disciples in Jesus' absence that they should not give up on the hope of the eschatological coming. He is going to come. They can feel confident about that. In fact, the book of Acts, the opening sermons that Peter delivers to Jerusalem are largely focused on this question. They have to address to this Jerusalem audience, how can Jesus be Messiah? And yet, he's gone. He's absent. There's no restoration of all things. There's no eschatological revelation of his glory, of the Son of David seated on the throne, and of the world judged and the righteous delivered, and so on. All right. So, in summary, we can say concisely that what Jesus is doing is announcing to the disciples for the first time in chapter 16 his death, his resurrection, his departure, his absence. He is not right now going to be fulfilling the eschatological coming of the full restoration of the world. He's only inaugurating it. He's only beginning it with his death and resurrection. Then he's going to be absent. And now the disciples have to have a new paradigm for following him, that they may themselves face death. They will face persecution, opposition for some undefined, unrevealed duration of time. He never talks about it in chapter 16. But then he reaffirms there will be, nonetheless, an eschatological coming, a coming in his glory, where he will be publicly revealed. He will restore the world. He will judge the wicked. And the disciples need to not give up in their hope or their confidence in that eschatological coming, the second coming as we call it. And then he makes a prediction. He says, look, some of those here, before they even get near to death, will see, although I would now say that basically he means glimpse, but they will see, they will catch sight of the coming of the Son of Man in glory. And then just within a week or so later, or about a week later, he takes some of the disciples up and he gives them a glimpse of this eschatological glorification of himself in his person with resurrected saints. And he does that again to confirm their faith in the Old Testament prophets, in what was predicted about the Messiah's coming, because after he's dead and gone and they're living and suffering in his absence and taking up their cross daily, they'll have that vision on the Mount of Transfiguration to confirm and remind them and reaffirm the truth of the Scriptures, the truth of Jesus' words, the truth of his claims to be the Messiah, that he will come back. And not just come back, but come back in fulfillment of Jesus' own promise. He could have provided the glimpse of his eschatological coming on the Mount of Transfiguration without the prediction in chapter 16, verse 28. The prediction is crucial for the disciples and for the church at large and for the three synoptic evangelists, because then when the disciples view the eschatological coming of Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, it's a confirmation of Jesus' prediction, a confirmation of his word. It fulfills his word, just as the church in the days of the evangelists are waiting on the promise of Jesus' coming still in its fullness. And then this is why the disciples, Peter, James, and John, coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration, having experienced what they understood to be the beginning of his eschatological coming, or at least a glimpse of it, they then, as a result of that, asked the question, but I thought Elijah was supposed to come first, come before this great glorified coming of you, the Messiah. All right, so I think that's just a concise way at the end there to describe the narrative, the thought flow, what Luke does with it, how Matthew would see this as important to Christians even 30, 40, 50 years later, and then I've also given a lot more in not just describing it concisely, but have also given all the dots that connect in the progression of the narrative and so on. At least I've tried to give that kind of two-layered reading, a very concise description of it, as well as a more lengthy accounting of all the word choice and the progression, the thought flow, and so on. What you get to do now is test drive it. You can go read all these passages for yourself and test drive this reading, the one I've provided, against the other readings, I think this is by far the most natural way to read it. Whatever your thoughts are, your criticisms, your agreements, join us over at the iPub YouTube channel where we cross-post all these podcasts, and give us your thoughts, your feedback, your questions, and so on. Until next time.